Hey everybody, welcome to the Renovation Theory podcast. We're trying to break down barriers through authentic conversations. We're your hosts. I'm Pat, and this is Britt.
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about political correctness and social contexts of things and how they might change from over the course of years and through different lenses.
I'm just going to say it. I'm going to say it right away in this episode. There's going to be a lot of the M word.
Yeah.
Millennials.
It's probably going to happen.
It's definitely going to happen. We are millennials.
True, on the older end.
On the older end of millennials, and I'm sure that'll get brought up here because that, at least, you know, for us millennial snowflakes, we think we're unique in the millennial category.
Of course.
But
we wouldn't be good millennials otherwise.
Right. But the thing that has kind of brought on this conversation and why we want to have this conversation now is most recently there was, over holiday season, there was a little bit of a pushback. I was going to say outrage, but outrage is probably too strong of a word. Pushback for the song Baby It's Cold Outside and it not being an appropriate song to play on the radio. And there were lots of people, not just millennials, but lots of people saying that song is promoting things we don't want to teach our children.
Well, and to be fair, I don't think this is the first year that's happened.
That's true.
I think it's each side is growing ever more ever louder about their side of the issue, and it goes away for 11 months and then comes back for one. So, this is, it had a little bit more coverage, I feel like, and we talked about it a little bit more than we have in the past, but it isn't a new thing.
It gains a little bit more steam maybe every year. But also at the beginning of 2018, there was a movement, it also might be a strong word, but some pushback for the show Friends. Mm-hmm. All 10 seasons, 11 seasons came out on 10. Netflix. And there were a bunch of millennials who were saying this show shouldn't be aired. I can't believe this show was ever allowed to get produced and made. Sexism and homophobic stuff. Yeah, right. There was some transgender issues that weren't represented appropriately in the show.
Some people mentioned lack of diversity on the cast in New York City, which is, should be one of the more diverse representations.
Exactly, yeah. And then pretty recently, there's been some pushback for the show Seinfeld for a lot of the same reasons as the Friends. They misrepresent or talk about disparagingly marginalized groups of people.
Yeah.
And
there's a lot of racial stereotypes. Yeah. Specifically.
Soup Nazi is one of the big ones. And, that obviously picks on Jewish people. And that culture, especially around a hard issue like World War II and Nazis. But we just want to talk about if that's an acceptable reaction to shows like this and songs like this and issues like this, or is it just another issue that millennials are making a big deal about nothing? Yeah,
well, as you were saying that, it kind of made me think about, we are in a little bit of a unique place because, I can remember like we watched Caddyshack and Ghost and some stuff that was like a little beyond. We've had the ability to watch content that was before our time before, but I think in that case, like the only reason I watched those were because my parents wanted me to, and they were there in the room, and there's probably a few exceptions. Princess Bride is one that's kind of lived on for quite a long time.
It's such a good movie.
But in the case of these two, specifically the TV shows, we're talking about streaming content that's just been added to Netflix, which is producing a ton of very opposite to that content.
Brand new content, yeah.
Brand new content that's very, accepting, and the language is very different. You have things like Queer Eye and a ton of content that is the opposite of some of the language that you see in some of these shows.
That is centered around some of those
inclusion and acceptance and finding those stories, telling those stories, and that kind of thing. So I think there is an aspect of it just being a stark contrast from a lot of the other content, specifically in Netflix, but also just how, and not every show that was ever produced in the 90s is being put up on Netflix, but
can we bring back American Gladiators?
But how much of that is just the ability, the access to the content that we didn't have at the scale that we have now.
Sure.
When we were younger or whatever. Or our parents were younger.
The show is neither of the shows ever died. I mean, Friends was a hit for 10 seasons for a reason, right. And Seinfeld was a hit for, I think, longer than that for a reason. And episodes or clips have been around, so it's not like the show went into hibernation and now it's all of a sudden back in a brand new way. It's just that Netflix, always wanting to put out content that people are going to want to watch, picks up a show that was wildly successful for 10 seasons and puts it out on its platform to get people to watch the show.
Well, and knowing that there are a bunch of people that pay for Netflix that watch Friends the first time around and wouldn't think anything of it.
Right.
But I also think there's a piece to there's other shows like say Full House, which is out there, which, it's, you watch that now and it's a little outdated and they probably don't center around a lot of those issues, but they also don't highlight them either.
Sure.
And so it maybe has a little bit more quote unquote staying power because it's safer. And so,
but I mean, if you're taking some of the issues that people have had with Friends and Seinfeld, there would definitely be issues about pretty much, you could find issue with any show, but I mean, sure. Full House, lack of diversity in the cast is one of those. Granted, they're not in New York, the cosmopolitan capital of the world.
They're in San Francisco.
But it's still San Francisco. But I guess the big question I have, and that I kind of wrestle with, is that an appropriate reaction to those shows? I'm not, on one hand, I think it's ridiculous that we're applying today's standards, whether we're talking about social issues or political issues, political correctness, whatever term you want to use to talk about those many issues. I think it's ridiculous that we apply today's political correctness standards to shows that were made 30 plus years ago. I mean, it's not like these were just shows that were on when, 10 years ago. These were shows that were made in the 90s, and the standards were different at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point, but I think at the same time, it's a fine line because there's been a ton of, and continues to be a ton of, using stories from 30, 50, 60, 70 plus years to tell a story. So, we continue to see stories of, blatant racism and then acceptance told through older stories, kind of retold through the lens of today, or, slavery, and really contrasting that or comparing it almost to how, highlighting how little things maybe have changed by showing it through a story that's 70 years old, and then allowing people to kind of see themselves in it and say, "Ooh, I need to work on that." So for some reason, we don't have that same gut reaction when it's drama or a more seriously told story.
Sure.
But something I think about comedy and making light of that specifically causes this knee-jerk reaction that's very defensive, I think, and poking light at making light of something that's a very serious issue for a lot of people, and a platform for a lot of people too. So I think that's part of it.
And as comedians, I know a couple comedians they know that that's going to happen to a lot of their jokes. I mean, a lot of comedians' jokes are at the expense of other people,
right?
Whether it's an individual or whether it's a group of people, stereotyping, that's a lot of what comedy is, and especially comedy that's going to be mass appeal enough to be part of a show like Seinfeld or Friends.
Right.
You have to play on very broad stereotypes. And those stereotypes happen to be early 90s stereotypes.
Right.
And we have had 30 plus years of evolution, of growth as a culture,
change.
progress. Yeah. To know that those aren't appropriate stereotypes to use anymore. Those same jokes would never fly in a TV show now.
Right. But at the same time, I think it's so to that point, I don't necessarily think the issue is the offense. I don't think that we should have to look at something that makes jokes that are 30 years old and say that I think that's funny. I think you're allowed to say that it's offensive. I think where it becomes sort of blown out of proportion, however you want to say it, is that people feel the need to take to social media and complain about how, terribly unaccepting and whatever it is, outside of the lens of this was a TV show that was created 30 years ago. Of course, it's going to have some things that are different. I mean, I think there's a separation. If a millennial were to watch something from the 50s and see a very normal, like gender roles in the 50s,
Leave It to Beaver.
Sure, type of show, there's an understanding and acceptance that we've come a certain way from that understanding, and that's not a normal way of life, and that's not the way that people interact. But for some reason, with the shorter period of time in these issues, and maybe it's because they're issues that
we're still fighting about.
Sure, or they make people kind of, it's a trigger or a sensitive issue or whatever, that we tend to kind of overreact to the seriousness of that piece of, comedy or information, TV show, song, whatever it is. I think one of the reasons that the whole Baby It's Cold Outside thing got so much press and information or like coverage this year was because of Me Too.
Right.
And feeling very, while it's felt sort of inappropriate and kind of tonally awkward before, it feels very backwards in comparison to the dialogue around the Me Too movement. And so that when you have that, then it makes people look at it even a step deeper. And then it becomes, and there's more of a conversation to be had about why it should or shouldn't be banned in the context of Me Too.
But I understand. I'm a little bit more accepting of the Baby It's Cold Outside and trying not to get that played, because that's a song, and that one's questionable.
Yeah.
And it's far from the best Christmas song. So not playing that one is one thing. But a TV, like, I don't know, there's some disconnect in my brain between calling up a radio station and saying, hey, I find that song offensive, I wish you wouldn't play that. When I've worked at radio stations taking calls like that happens a lot, and that's an acceptable thing for people to do. I don't want to hear that song, I don't like that song, or I want to hear this song for whatever reason. But for some reason, there's just something different in my head about Netflix pulling up, releasing all 10 seasons of Friends, and that same level of, we need to get this show. How dare Netflix put this on their platform? It's the same thing. Like, you're calling the distributor who didn't make that content and saying, times have changed. We've moved past this language and this way of thinking. Don't play that song or don't play that show. But for some reason, as I'm thinking about it and have heard a lot of people talk about it, it seems a little bit more extra. to use a millennial term.
Sure.
to demand a show be taken off of Netflix than it does for a song to be taken off of the radio.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know. It's interesting because I can see the side of that, but I think, you know, when you think about the pervasiveness of the thinking and the impact of one 3-minute song versus 10 seasons of 23-minute shows,
sure.
And you know, I have no idea how many references or instances or pieces in there that people are, questioning, but I almost feel the opposite way of that. There is a breadth of time and energy and effort, and, you know, both the words that are being spoken as well as the images and the star power behind those actors and actresses still to this day. Yeah. That lends a credibility to it that maybe that song that gets played for 1 month out of the year doesn't, and it's, you know, in rotation and stuff like that, doesn't hold. So, you know, I can see both sides of that argument. And I think, you know, the question just comes of whether or not, you know, what's the judgment call for that? Like what's the redeeming quality or the reason that we decide to keep that stuff on? You know, in the case of Baby It's Cold Outside, it's tradition and
it's a quote unquote classic.
Right. And I think there's kind of similar arguments around the shows as well. They're super successful shows with super successful actors, and there's a lot of things in them that are probably fairly timeless in the sense of, you know, financial struggles and living together and relationships and
trying to live life in New York City.
Yeah, jobs. And I mean, as I'm just kind of skimming through some episode content in my head, it is a very millennial story in a lot of ways. But then at the same time,
it's just not. You're right. It is a millennial story in a lot of ways, mm-hmm. even though how old were I have never seen an entire episode of Friends, and I may have seen a couple of full episodes of Seinfeld. So not an expert on either show here. How old were the Friends characters in the show?
I don't remember for sure off the top of my head, but I'm solidly 20s for most of it. And then I think the Seinfeld characters were older. Like
the Seinfeld characters were older.
Solidly 30s probably would be my guess.
So in that sense, Friends was for sure millennials. I mean, if we're going to take the age of the characters right. in the show and play it today, they're millennials. Mm-hmm. You know, obviously they've grown up in 30 years. But so you're right in saying that it is a millennial struggle, and so it
should be themes that resonate in general, themes that resonate very much with that same group of people.
And
in theory.
I think they do.
Right.
I mean, if today's millennials as opposed to yesterday's millennials, if we millennials could not that you want to overlook, but to overlook whatever sure. issues you have, there are lots of themes in there. Okay, I haven't seen it. There have to be lots of themes in there if it was such a successful show.
Right.
But the people who are complaining and making a big deal about the way different issues are addressed in the show aren't getting past those. Not that they should. I mean, mm-hmm. some of those issues are not issues that we just overlook, and that's, you know, that's why we're having this conversation. Right. But in the context of a show that was made and produced 30 years ago, I just question whether or not we even need to be worrying about this. It was a right. show that was made 30 years ago. Can't we dismiss that and say it was a different time?
Well, and I think that's where and why there's such a huge gap in this conversation right now, because I think for every millennial aged person who watches it and finds it to be very disingenuous and not an accurate representation or even a close representation to the life that they're trying to live today, there's probably another millennial that it's not that far off for them. And, you know, a millennial, I think part of it is that New York experience, but I have a few friends that live in New York, and from what I know of the lifestyle that they're living, it's very different than what's being shown on that TV show. So I think in some ways, some parts of our culture have remained a lot unchanged, and then there are some areas of our culture that have changed drastically. And so I think that that potentially plays into it. But I think the reactions that are the loudest are the people that have made more drastic changes, and so that experience in that show feels really disingenuous. My point is, though, you know, and I think it's yours too, so it feels disingenuous to you, don't watch it. Done. Right. Yeah. You know, like, at what point do we continue this crusade of everything in media and entertainment needs to look exactly like I think it needs to look, which is a really tough thing to accomplish when you have people who still live...
Millions of people.
Well, yeah. I mean, you have people who still live in small town, rural, Bible Belt, blue collar kind of job situations. And then you have people who, you know, frequent different kinds of, like...
more progressive.
Yeah.
Quote, progressive lifestyles, or, you know... I was just thinking about something.
Yes.
So, Friends is a group of millennials.
Well, it's not, but...
Friends is a group of 20-somethings.
There you go.
Living in New York City.
Okay.
In the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And they are arguably not super inclusive.
As far as the cast goes.
Or diverse.
Sure.
The writing for the show makes fun of marginalized, makes homophobic references, and isn't one of the characters' dad transgender?
Mm-hmm.
But then, so I was just thinking, like, there's got to be other shows, other popular media from the 2000s or from the 90s that also have groups of 20-year-olds dealing with life in New York City. One of the first shows that comes to my mind is Rent. I love musicals, and that's one of my favorite musicals. And that's portraying basically the same life, living in New York City, group of friends, 20-somethings, but it is far more inclusive, and maybe inclusive. I mean, it definitely is inclusive, but it's, first of all, it's written for a different purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Friends was written to be a comedy, and Rent was not.
Right.
But it's definitely a more accurate representation.
I mean, from what measurement, I guess.
Okay.
You know,
right.
I think it is a more diverse representation. I mean, but no matter what 6 people you would ever choose, you're not going to get an accurate representation of New York City. That's not possible.
Sure. But isn't it a more accurate representation? If you're
probably. I mean, 6 white people versus 6 non-white, non-straight people. I think you're probably, well, not all of them are not white, but anyways, You get the point. But yeah, I mean, I think the point is,
so there was media made at that time,
right?
That holds up better to our social awareness standards today.
Totally. But I mean, to the point of that, I think that was the point of that was progressive, and its agenda was to talk about those issues.
Sure.
Whereas the agenda and purpose of Friends was primetime mainstream comedy sitcom. You know, that
would appeal to somebody who lives in New York, or somebody that lives in Kansas, or somebody that lives in Nevada.
Sure. And so, I mean, and that's your point is, do we need to judge all media on the same scale? And, I think there's definitely a moment. I'm going to say my answer to this question is yes. And that, yes, I think millennials need to toughen up their skin a little bit and not take to social media to complain about every issue they ever disagreed with. But I also think that there's an opportunity for people who see those articles and kind of scoff at them, whether that be the Baby It's Cold Outside or Friends or whatever, to look back at those things and say what valid points are being made about this. I think there's valid points to, when you talk about Baby It's Cold Outside, the two main arguments are the language is very rape culture-esque and inappropriate and kind of implies the wrong thing, and the other side is it was written forever ago and the language means totally different things. And there's truth to both of those, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Right. The language is borderline creepy if you take it
for sure.
If you take it in today's context, and I think that's worth considering. But there is a classicness that warrants it not just being thrown away just because somebody doesn't like what it says. And I think that's really well illustrated by the Holderness family did a remake of the song of it, where all the language is changed, and I think it does a really nice.
The male perspective language has changed,
right?
The female words,
yes, right, yep.
doesn't change,
right? So
we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's pretty funny if you haven't seen it, and but I think there is an aspect of, rather than just being offended or just ignoring it, having a conversation and saying, what is it about this that I don't like? What is it about it that's good? What is it about it that we need to change? What things about Friends are still a pervasive part of our culture that we need to address still? It's not like everything in there is all good or all bad.
So I guess the question that I pose after you say that is, at what point would something be too bad or cross the line to where a TV show shouldn't be re-aired, a song shouldn't be put on the radio anymore? It is a song, TV show, media, whatever, that was made 30, 100 years ago. Do our improving, changing standards of political correctness and morality, if you want to take it that far, ever warrant us completely, wiping said media off of the planet?
I mean, I'm sure there has to be. This seems extreme, so I'm sorry if this, not just using this as an example, but if there were shows or videos or whatever of like the Ku Klux Klan doing what they did, that would be an obvious line. I'm just trying to go for the extreme here. So it's like, there definitely are moments where activities that groups of people thought were okay become widely accepted as not okay.
Right.
But I think, even taking that example, that was never presented as comedy. That's not to say that comedy just is a forgiveness blanket for everything that anybody ever says, but it does need to be interpreted in a different way, I think, than other forms of, news or media or movies or whatever that we consume. I mean, and it's a tough line, but that's what this all comes down to is, it's if it was black and white, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So, I mean, I think there's just, to me, I see that there's this opportunity for us to I think in everything, to not just let the knee-jerk reaction control these emotions. And like, not that you can't have a knee-jerk reaction, but what is going to be my reaction to my knee-jerk reaction?
That's kind of what I was going to say, is the knee-jerk reaction is fine. You can have a knee-jerk reaction, and that's kind of what Twitter's for.
Sure.
Have a knee-jerk reaction and put it out on Twitter.
Nobody will see it anyway.
That's very few people will. But, and I think the biggest disconnect here is that knee-jerk reaction in a lot of instances isn't taken as a conversation starter.
Right.
You can have the knee-jerk reaction and say, I'm not okay with how that character is portrayed, or that joke that they just made on Seinfeld about whatever. That knee-jerk reaction is fine. That's good. That's part of progress as a culture. We realize that that's a bit of an insensitive comment, and we have to be able to say that. But maybe the biggest disconnect and what we need to get better at is taking that as a conversation starter, or using that as a conversation starter. And I don't think, on both sides, I don't think it's presented as a conversation starter a lot of times from us millennials who are boycotting these things or complaining about these things. And I definitely don't think it's taken as a conversation starter from, say, people who loved Friends or Seinfeld the first time around and are glad it's back on TV so that they can watch it all again.
Right.
And that's a conversation that, we are trying to have on this podcast. And I know there are a lot of people who would be willing to have that conversation, whether it's on social media or in person or whatever. But I'm also very aware that a lot of people just don't care to have that conversation on both sides.
And that's fine too. I think it depends on what the issue is, I think, but we can't expect that everybody's going to feel super passionately about every issue that ever exists.
Right.
And so finding the people that do and having that conversation with the people who do care. And I know, I think social media has made us a little averse to talking to people who disagree with you because it tends to be this mountaintop mentality that we talk about a lot. But I think if you can find a community where you're able to have that conversation in a more productive way, there's common ground to be had. And there's discussions about, so what is it about that? One of the things that was brought up was the lesbian wedding in Friends. So what is it about that portrayal that makes you uncomfortable or angry or whatever? Like, I should be able to ask that question to somebody who's offended and have a real conversation with them. And it doesn't have to be angry. It doesn't have to be crazy or yelling or anything. It's just, there's a reason why that was a trigger or something that stirred up certain emotions. And if we can't talk about, I think we have to be willing to talk about it as the person who's bringing it to the table, but then we also have to be able to talk about it as the other person who's sitting at the table and say, I want to hear more. I want to understand, because otherwise we're just glossing over what the real heart issue is. The issue isn't about Friends. That's not what the problem is.
Right.
And so, we sit and we talk about Friends and whether or not Friends is good or bad, when realistically it's saying that person,
whether they air Friends or not on Netflix, that's still an issue that needs to be brought up and talked about. It's just that people can say, can sweep it under the rug if Friends is not there, or avoid it. Maybe
what's ultimately happening is somebody saying, that was my parents, or that was me and my girlfriend, or that was, my best friend from high school that I'm seeing in that person.
Sure.
And so it's not about those characters. It's, it's not about the non-existent people and Baby It's Cold Outside. It's about what that mentality represents to people. It's about, somebody who has experienced rape, and every time they hear that song on the radio, that triggers that experience for them or whatever. And so I think there's a piece of people who may not be the offended to look at that and say, why are people rising up so much against this, and what do they see in it that I don't see in it?
But also, I think there is an aspect, kind of going back to the different purposes between, say, Rent and Friends. it's still, even though it's a sitcom, it still is a piece of art that somebody thought was valuable to bring that issue up. And maybe they do it in a slightly offensive way for 90s culture and a very offensive way for, 2019 culture. But maybe we have to look at it as more of a piece of art that's trying to start that conversation, or that's trying to bring something into the light.
Right.
They're just doing it in very, very different ways.
Well, and what they were talking about in the article that we can link to is for the 90s, that was trying to normalize, LGBT, relationships. I mean, that just wasn't shown on TV. So back then, that was pretty progressive way of trying to bring that into the conversation,
into the mainstream conversation,
right? In a landscape where that really wasn't done much.
Sure.
And so, you have to take that into consideration and say, think about how much that conversation has changed in 30 years drastically. I mean, so it's like there needs to be some forgiveness in the sense of, like you're saying, as a piece of art, they were just looking for ways to bring that in a way that wouldn't be canceled, and get the show canceled. That would still be acceptable to the media or to the
producers
audience at large.
Yeah.
And so, that looks really different. And this goes a lot of different ways. As we've talked about this a lot of times before, that as churchgoers, Christians, whatever you want to call it, the way that Christians are portrayed in media drives me absolutely
for sure.
insane. In fact, I was just watching an episode of The Fosters last night, which I'm also watching on Netflix, which is the early 2000s show, where the pastor's son was gay, and he was just, talking about his boyfriend, and I was like, I don't know if I've ever seen that on TV before. And just, like in that case, I was a little bit grateful to see that, in the sense of, like, that's just a small representation of, people have such a hard time understanding and portraying large groups of people because they're not all the same. So we tend to put them into a box, but there are a lot of people that fall into that category, and more of them now, of being accepting of LGBT in their church and being part of the leadership and all of that kind of stuff. And so it just was really interesting to me to see that, because you see a lot of times the opposite story,
right,
from TV representations,
where that son would be kicked out of the family and disowned and everything just for that. And that's probably the more often portrayed side of things.
Yeah, and they I guess, I don't know, there's been other characters with similar stories set in the show, and the show has the parents are it's two moms, and so it's a very common theme throughout that show. But anyways, it hit me that it's not just that specific issue. I mean, I think that's true. I think everybody would say that, my grandparents were Japanese Americans, and the way Japanese Americans are portrayed in the media, and the way, or specifically in comedies, and that was a huge thing this year. There were several with Crazy Rich Asians and To All the Boys I've Loved Before, and I think there was another one that had really strong female Asian representation for like the first time in forever, and that was a huge thing. So it's like, I think there's this aspect of,
we've come a long way.
Yeah. And let's have conversations, but let's not dwell on every mistake we made along the way as they come back up.
So I think the big issue here is being more intentional on social media. And that's a point that we've made before. But if you're complaining about something, make it a conversation starter, or make it something that's worthwhile in its complaining. And if you're on the other side of that, use that as a conversation starter and say, well, I may not be offended by that, but why is this person offended by it? And I think that's way easier said than done.
Sure.
But that's a big reason why we started this podcast. And not only this podcast, but the Facebook group that goes along with it. So if you search for Renovation Theory on Facebook, you'll find our Facebook group. And we want this to be a conversation starter, this podcast. And so if you have anything to add to this conversation about any of the things we talked about or something that's related to this, we would love to hear your thoughts in the Facebook group. And if you have any ideas for us going forward to talk about on future episodes, we would love to hear your thoughts there as we continue to make more episodes like this.
Yeah, and we always put all the links that we mention on our website. And then if you have any relevant links of other similar topics that you've heard about or good discussions that you've seen, we'd love to hear about those too, and we'll keep kind of a running list of relevant links.
Yep, that's renovationtheory.com. And if you haven't subscribed, we would appreciate if you would subscribe either on YouTube or your favorite podcast player. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, we would love to hear, get a rating and a review from you as well. In the meantime, we will see you next week.